Welcome to Simply by Grace, a podcast of Grace Life Ministries with founder and director Dr. Charlie Bing. This podcast and other helpful resources can be found at our website, gracelife.org. Now, here's Dr. Bing.
You're joining us today for another in our series called Grace Stories, where we hear the stories of how God has worked in people's lives, usually how they were saved eternally, and what God's grace has meant to them then, and maybe even now today. And you know that grace is a word that is used quite a bit in our Christian culture, and even in regular culture. It can mean anything from someone who dances or acts beautifully or delicately to something we say before dinner. There's a lot of different ways we use the word, but grace becomes most important when we talk about how it interacts with us in God's expression of love that saves us. And today we're going to hear a story from someone who encountered God's grace. And I met him in Florida not long ago and was intrigued by the little details of his story. And I think you'll really enjoy hearing from him. So this is Keith Stanton. He's presently working with Ethnos 360 as a missionary role, support role. Well, welcome, Keith.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we're glad you can be with us and appreciate your willingness to tell the story. I don't know exactly where to begin, but I met you in Florida, but where are you from?
I'm from Southern California. Spent most of my formative years in Carlsbad, which is in the north part of San Diego County.
Okay, and isn't that where your wife Jacqueline is from also?
Similar, yeah. She's actually from Hemet, which is kind of in between there and Palm Springs.
Okay, so Southern California, and now
Yep.
You're in Florida. Well, that's what was life like for you in growing up in Southern California?
It was great, actually. I always say my parents were and are incredible. Very just good, loving, moral people. My wife sometimes jokes about it and says that I had the Brady Bunch family growing up.
How many siblings did you have?
It wasn't based on the number of siblings, but the nature of the family relationship. But I just I have one sister who's about a year and a half older than I am.
Okay. So Brady Bunch, you kind of think of the ideal type of family. Yeah.
Right.
So did you go to church with your family?
We did, yeah. Went to church every week as far as I can remember going back. I think for me, I remember learning the stories and learning that alongside various other Curious George and other fairy tales, and kind of putting them all in the same category of folklore that had some sort of moral to the story that your parents would teach you to try to help raise you to be a good moral person.
Mm-hmm.
So my mom was a school teacher. A lot of emphasis on education and the importance of education to get a good job, to give yourself financial stability so that you could raise your kids in a nice neighborhood and kind of rinse and repeat. That was. I'm not saying that's what was verbally communicated to me, but that was the idea that I kind of picked up on of what Christianity was.
Okay. Well, basically, it sounds like you had a stable family and a nice upbringing in general.
Very much so.
You're able to speak well of your parents, and that's always a plus. How are you as a student in school?
I did quite well, actually, just because of the emphasis on education. I was always kind of a rascal, so they actually I was set to skip a grade. But during the test, I think my pencil fell on the floor and I was crawling around on the ground. They said I was too immature to skip to the next grade, so they kept me in the grade I was in. But I always excelled academically. even though I also enjoyed getting into a bit of mischief.
Yeah. Well, teenager years, I'm assuming, would probably include that for a lot of people. Were you involved in sports in school?
I was, yeah. Played most every sport that was available to me: soccer, baseball, football, basketball, and later on got into surfing. Actually,
Really? Yeah, from Southern California. You need to do that. So, what were your greatest
yeah, it's
influences? What's that?
interesting. It's interesting. We actually, I had a surf team at my high school, so it was actually a high school sport to be on the surf team.
Okay, high school sport. Wow.
Yeah.
So what were your influences in those years? Was your high school friends a good group, being on a surf team and things like that? Was that good for you?
Probably, hindsight, probably the worst thing that happened to me.
Ooh.
So I'm playing tennis and, some of the other sports I was playing, I was around a certain crowd that weren't getting into as much trouble. Once I started surfing, kind of a different friend group that I got involved with, that's where I started experimenting with smoking pot and drinking and things like that. So I was about 12, 13 when I started dabbling in it. By the time I was 14, and then all the way, through high school and into my college years, it was a daily thing for me.
Drugs were a daily thing.
Yeah.
Drinking also went along with that.
As well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how bad was the drugs? I mean, you couldn't function without them, or would you call yourself an addict at that time?
Yeah. I wouldn't. It's interesting because I think for many people that get into drugs and alcohol, it's for a matter of trying to mask or hide something.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably an element of that, maybe insecurity for me, but for the most part, it actually just had to do with what I thought was having fun.
Mm-hmm.
Just getting inebriated and then doing stupid things with my friends. And I guess I've always been a little bit of an adrenaline junkie, so those things kind of went hand in hand for me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, sometimes when you mix the wrong people and drugs, you get into trouble, bad situations, and I believe you got into some trouble. What happened?
Yeah, multiple times. Actually went to jail several times between, even as a juvenile and then as an adult. Believe it was 7 times total that I got arrested. But the final time was 21 years old. Got arrested for it was drunk driving and reckless driving, and some other charges associated with that. And ended up going to jail and was actually looking at a 5-year prison sentence, and spent several months in jail before I finally got my sentence in there.
Before you finally got you?
Before I was finally sentenced.
Oh, you said several months before you were sentenced.
Yeah.
You weren't out on bail then?
No, they I think they wouldn't even give me a bail because I had a warrant for almost 2 years before they finally caught me. It was mostly drug related charges. But yeah, once they got a hold of me, I think they didn't want to let me go.
Boy. So just sitting there wondering what you're going to be sentenced to must have been quite an emotionally down experience.
Yeah, I think for me, I believe it's Psalm 14:1 that says that the fool says in his heart there is no God, and his deeds were abominable. Yeah, and I think that's a perfect description of who I was. I had rejected the concept of a God.
Hmm.
And because of that, I had also made the connection between a God and morality. And so I said, if there is no God, there is no absolute morality,
Mm-hmm.
and was functioning under a more rationalistic and hedonistic worldview, where the only point of life is pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly wasn't concerned about death. I assumed I would die
Hmm.
at any moment based on the lifestyle I was living. But I just didn't care because I didn't believe there was an afterlife. And I thought that what I was doing was the best way I knew how to have fun.
Hmm.
I thought when I looked at other people and their morality that they were attempting to live by,
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was constraining, because I knew that they wanted to do the things that they were choosing to not do. And it didn't make sense to me. I'm like, why are you stopping? What's stopping you?
Mm-hmm.
Why not just do the things that you want to do? And so that was the mindset that I approached life with. And so, up until that point, I thought my conscience was something that I just needed to overcome. That was instilled into me because of the way I was raised.
Mm-hmm.
And that if I could just simply overcome my conscience, that I would have more joy and pleasure in life.
Yeah.
Not get rid of that pesky feeling of guilt, right?
Not quite as simple as that, though, is it? The Bible says that God has written his law on our hearts. And we know very well the difference between right and wrong, even without a Bible to guide us or parents. There's something inside of our hearts that can tell us. But you didn't have that feeling. And it surprises me a little bit that you weren't really concerned about dying, because even that you thought about it, because many people in their teenage years don't even think about dying, much less what happens afterwards.
Yeah, I actually have several of my friends who have passed away, either before that time or since that time, just based on the lifestyle that we were living and pursuing.
That's sad. So
it is, yeah. It's
you're sitting in. Go
I
ahead.
was gonna say it's interesting looking back on that period of my life, because when I do, it's almost more like a movie. It doesn't seem like me and my own experiences. It doesn't seem like memories that I'm looking back on. It's so divorced from who I am now
Mm-hmm.
that I can recollect it and think back and consider what took place. But I was such a different person then from who I am now. It's hard to even connect that to my own life.
I think there's a lot of us that understand what you're talking about. When God changes you, it just seems like a different new creation, and it's a new life. So while you're waiting to be sentenced, there must have been all kinds of things going through your head. And then what is it that happened on the day that you faced the court?
Yeah. So in terms of, I brought up the idea related to kind of dulling our conscience, because I believe that drugs and alcohol definitely assist in that process. So once I was, in jail, it was forced sobriety, and I think that was a big part of, God having the opportunity to start cutting through the fog and all the excuses that I had made up about why he wasn't real and why I didn't stand accountable to him. And so it was, a few weeks after being in jail that he really started just tearing down all the excuses that I had and convincing me that he was real. At the time, I didn't have anyone preaching to me. I didn't have a Bible, but growing up Christian and even going to college, I used to debate the Christians that would come on campus to do evangelism and outreach, because I thought I was trying to free them from their delusion.
Yeah.
So I knew what the Bible taught, I knew what, who God was according to the Bible, who Jesus was according to the Bible. I just, thought it was made up, that people created this system that, assisted them to get through life because of their own weakness and their own, feebleness of mind, is kind of how I would have seen it.
Mhm.
But once God was able to break through all of that for me and convince me that he was real, I very quickly put it together that if God is real, he's a moral being, and he holds me accountable to his moral standard. I knew that I did not meet his moral standard. Therefore, I deserved whatever judgment that he would provide for me. And I understood that judgment to be hell. And once those pieces came together and I came to a place where I personally realized that I was condemned to hell, that's when Jesus finally made sense to me personally.
Mm-hmm. And in the timeline of your incarceration, how long into it did this happen, or did this realization come?
It was, I'm not sure the exact timing. I would guess about 3 or 4 weeks into my time.
Okay, so before you were sentenced, is what you're saying?
Correct. Yeah. So as soon as I got saved, so once I put all those pieces together, I actually got down on my knees in the jail cell, and just said, God, forgive me. I realize I've, offended you and rebelled against you. And, thank you for sending Jesus to die for me. And I understood what he had done for me at that moment. And I do explain, I think sometimes the way I explain it is that I had experienced pleasure up until that point, but I'd never experienced joy before.
Mm.
And so at that moment, what I had experienced was profoundly different than any temporal pleasure that I had experienced up until that point.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, I had sprinted so hard in the other direction, and the law of diminishing return. You continue to do the same thing, but without getting the same benefit. So you have to do it more or harder or deeper.
Mm-hmm.
But then in this relationship with God, the joy that I was experiencing that was just stable and consistent, I began to be evangelical before I even knew what that was or what it meant. I was just explaining to the people around me, hey, God is real. Jesus is real, and what he has to offer is better than anything else that you can find in this world.
And still, you didn't have any mentor or preacher or teacher? Certainly in jail, don't they have a chapel service or something?
They do, yeah. I first thing I did is I actually just got a hold of a Bible and started reading. And the jail I was in didn't have any work associated with it, so I basically sat in my jail cell all day and read the Bible for a couple of months. But it was a long process of God unraveling my wrong thinking and understanding of who he was. And I did actually start attending some sort of chapel while I was in there as well. So began to get a taste for fellowship and engaging and interacting with other believers.
Mm-hmm. So what was the total length of time you were incarcerated?
So about 3 months in, I finally went to my sentencing. It was an interesting story because the judge was looking at my paperwork, looking up at me. He had a pretty thick file folder sitting on his desk.
Not good.
He asked me, do you have anything to say before I sentence you? And I had actually rejected all of the plea bargains, the offers that they gave me. They tried to offer me a 2-year reduced sentence if I pled guilty and all that. And I just said, I'm just going to tell them exactly what happened, throw myself at the mercy of the court, and whatever happens, happens. So I was just leaving it in God's hands. And so that the judge, said, "Do you have any last words before I sentence you?" And so I actually just shared my testimony briefly with the judge in the courtroom. And it was dead silent. I don't know how long it was. It felt like several minutes. I'm sure it was just several seconds, but the judge finally looked up at me and said, "You know what? I don't know why, but I feel like I need to give you one more chance." And so he actually released me into a drug rehab program that same day.
Well, that's God's grace right there, that he used the judge show some leniency.
Definitely.
Yeah. So you told your story about reading the Bible and coming to a knowledge of salvation to the judge.
Yep. Yeah. And skipping ahead, or maybe I'll save that part for the later part of the story. But I did have an encounter with that same judge a few years later in my life.
Oh, way to bait the hook for us. We'll have to hear about that. So, when you end up in jail like that, it must be hard on your parents. How were your parents during this time?
It was devastating. Honestly, that was something I'm sure God used. I do have vivid memories of sitting, in your jail garb behind the plexiglass wall, chained to the other prisoners. Getting escorted in and out of the courtroom for different arraignment hearings before the actual judgment. And my parents sitting out in the audience, and I could just see the heartache on their faces, and I knew it was a result of the choices that I had made, the lifestyle that I was living.
Sin doesn't just hurt us; it doesn't just hurt God; it hurts the people around us too. So judge gives you another chance. What do you do with that? where do you go from there?
Yeah, it was interesting. They released me into this drug rehab program, and it was a 12-step program. And I was actually living with my parents. Had to use public transportation, but was getting around to these. I was working part-time, going to school part-time, and doing these drug rehab classes several hours a week. And they were going through this 12-step program, and I understood some of the principles and still believe there's value in many of them. But I knew that it was only by having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ that I had found freedom from the lifestyle that I was living up until that point. And so I was, again, very evangelistic with the group of students that I was with in that class. And a couple of them actually did come to know the Lord. And even the teacher, the leader of the group was previously Mormon. And I actually met him about a year later. And the first thing he said when I saw him was, "You were right." I'm like, what do you mean you were right? He's like, "Everything that you said about Jesus, you were right." And he's like, I'm saved now. I have a personal relationship with God.
Wow. That's great. So after the rehab, what'd you do?
Early on, actually, just a few weeks after I had been released and was going through this program, is when I met my wife. And there's an act of grace right there that she was willing to engage in a relationship with me. But yeah, she was great. It was great. She was raised Catholic, but did get saved at a Christian camp that she went to, where she heard a clear gospel presentation. And we were both excited about growing in our faith together. So we would do Bible studies together. We got involved in church together, started doing youth ministry together. And so that was a very formative time for both of us in terms of our faith. We actually had two different churches that we were involved with at the time. One was a small Presbyterian church,
Mm-hmm.
and the other was Calvary Chapel.
Mm-hmm.
So we got flavors of different forms or flavors of Christianity that we got exposed to.
Yeah. And today you work for a missions organization. What happened to get your attention about world missions?
So we had actually invited a guest speaker to come to one of our outreach events, who someone made the connection for us and told us about this guy who was a missionary to Papua New Guinea. He had taken his wife and his kids and gone to the jungles of Papua New Guinea with a tribal group there that were formerly practicing cannibalism. Very remote, very, I know that the term's not correct, but Stone Age, if you will, undeveloped.
Mm-hmm.
And he had gone through the entire process of learning their culture and language, developing an alphabet for them, through that translating the scriptures into their language, eventually teaching them the Bible. Once they had believers, they established a church, and that church was now self-sustaining, functioning on its own. And he was back here in the United States, mm-hmm. telling others, hey, there's more people groups like this that still haven't heard the gospel yet.
Mm-hmm.
So once we heard about that, that really shook us up, both my wife and I. When I went to work the next day, I honestly couldn't think straight. I couldn't focus on what I was doing. All I could think about is, why am I here trying to convince people to believe the gospel that they've already heard and have access to? There's 500 different translations of the Bible in English that they have available to them. A church on nearly every street corner, mm-hmm. and there's thousands of people groups that don't have a single word of the Bible translated and have zero access to the gospel. So that reality just struck my heart and mind, and thankfully my wife as well, to the point where we decided that that's what we're going to give our lives to.
Well, you used the term it really shook you up, which I think a lot of us, we hear these kind of statistics and facts about unreached people, but not many of us get shaken up. So praise the Lord for that. So did you make a commitment to him, or did you get in touch with a mission organization from that point?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. We told this guy who was now functioning as a missionary rep. So he was doing recruitment essentially. Okay. And we told him, hey, we want to do this, church planning thing. And then he said, okay, well, the first step is to begin your training. And we have a 4-year training program that is 2 years in Michigan and 2 years in Missouri. And growing up on the coast my entire life, I'd never lived more than a mile from the beach, and surfing was still a regular part of my life. That was
not ice
a
fishing.
bit of a shock to me. So I was like, are you sure that the training's necessary? I'm a youth pastor. I've been, leading Bible studies for a couple of years now. I'm running an outreach program. I think I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, sorry, it's a required step you have to take. Hindsight, I wish he would have explained that a little better, but maybe he told me what I needed to hear. But we went to the training because it was a quote unquote required step for us to get to doing church planting with unreached people groups. Mm-hmm. Within a couple of days, I realized I knew absolutely nothing about the scriptures, and I desperately needed the education that I received.
You didn't know what you didn't know.
Exactly.
I remember my first experience with Bible college was the same way. I was pretty well self-studied, and I went to that first class and I said, whoa, wait a minute. How can somebody know this much about the Bible? It's an
Yep,
eye-opening
exactly.
experience. So you just absorbed it and soaked it all in their 2-year program.
I did. Yeah, honestly, one of the things that really stuck out to me and was one of the biggest transformations for me was my understanding of grace. My mentor, towards the end of the first year, we had assigned mentors, and we would have regular meeting times. And in one of my summary evaluations, sat down with me and said, "You have an incredible understanding of grace for unbelievers, but you have zero understanding of grace for believers."
And then why did he say that?
Because I was very gracious towards unbelievers in accepting whatever, I was comfortable engaging with them no matter what their lifestyle was, because of what I had come out of, and was willing to, present truth to them. But I think part of it is because of my own experience in having a radical transformation. I had concluded that if others didn't have that same radical transformation, that they probably weren't saved. So in my mind, most of the people that I was engaging with at church, and even some of those at my Bible college, I assumed that they probably weren't saved because of their behavior. And it took close to at least a year for God to really unravel that thinking. Some of it probably came out of, from the churches that I had been involved with. Now I can put a label on it of lordship salvation. The Presbyterian Church was covenant reformed, and they had a version of lordship associated with it. The Calvary Chapel is more Arminian in nature, but they have a version of lordship in their theology as well that I had kind of merged together into, if you're not, fully chasing after God, and that's fully evident in your life, then you're probably not a believer. But going through the Bible the way that we did in our training, they start with bibliology. What is the Bible? Where did it come from? Is it reliable? All that kind of stuff. Hermeneutics was the very next class that you take. How do you interpret this book consistently to figure out what is it actually saying? Not reading your own thoughts and ideas into it, but getting out of it what God intended for you to get out of it. And then from there, just starting in Genesis and working through the entire Bible chronologically. So by approaching the scriptures in that way, it really unraveled a lot of my wrong thinking. I started seeing the dispensations more clearly. I could see that the call to discipleship was distinct from the call to belief in the resurrected Christ. So it was that transition going through the Bible in that way that God unraveled my thinking. I felt embarrassed about the way that I taught the book of James a year earlier. Once I went through the book of James,
we've all done it.
Understood it from a grace perspective.
So you finished Bible college, and you continued on with your training in Missouri, did you? For 2 years?
Yeah, exactly. And it was during that time actually that my wife started experiencing some health issues. At the time, we didn't know exactly what it was or the nature of it. So we pursued some different health avenues, treatments, and thought we were seeing some progress. So we continued to move forward towards our goal of church planting in Papua New Guinea. That was our plan. So we completed our training. We moved back to San Diego. We're doing our partnership development there. And her health continued to decline. And so we were just really wrestling with God. What do we do with this? We're willing to give our lives, and we'll even go with this health issue. But is it wiser to trust God and go, knowing that with a compromised immune system, there's a good chance that she may not make it.
And Papua New Guinea is from what I've heard, one of the least developed countries in the world. So it's not like you have good medical care and resources.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, even people with a strong, healthy immune system, many of them encounter health issues once they get there.
Mm-hmm. So God kind of redirected you from a direction towards the mission field into what you're doing today, or is there a pathway to what you're doing today?
Yeah. Thankfully we stayed in touch with one of our mentors at the Bible Institute in Michigan. And we were seeking counsel from him, explaining our situation, kind of what we were wrestling with. And he invited us to come on staff at the training center. At first, it was temporary, for a year or two to see if we could sort through the health stuff, and if we could get to a place where we could continue to move overseas, that we would do that. But 1 year turned into 2 years, turned into 4 years, turned into 8 years. So we ended up spending several years there, but it was again exactly what we needed. I believe that it was through that experience that I really came to understand grace in terms of discipleship, and what a proper understanding of keeping justification and sanctification distinct as birth truths and growth truths, and then helping believers come to grips with those growth truths and to grow in those truths and walk in those truths, and helping to prepare them for a life of ministry. God used that to help me grow, and by God's grace, I believe I've been able to help pass some of those things along to many students that have come through our training over the years.
And you're still with Ethnos 360, and what exactly are you doing with them right now?
Yeah, so we're still playing a role in helping train the students as they move through our training program. Our training program is essentially segmented into two main segments. The first 2 years is our Bible Institute, which is now in Wisconsin, and 2 years down in Missouri. So we have our Bible Institute for 2 years, and then the last 2 years is what we call our Missionary Training Center, where you learn linguistics, translation principles, cross-cultural communication, cultural anthropology, things like that. Okay. More specifically tailored towards missions. And so what we've done is actually created a program to work with our students who have completed the first phase of training and are in transition to the second phase of training.
Okay.
Because historically we would actually lose quite a few of our students in that transition as they went back to their home church, trying to raise funds and get the church support that they needed to continue on. It kind of turned into a bit of a black hole for many. So we created this program to stay engaged with them during that time.
Great. That's great. So I'm still on the hook about this judge story. You said you met him again. How did that
happen? We skipped over that part. So it was actually at the time that we got challenged into missions that we had a minor hurdle to get over, which was I was still on probation and wasn't allowed to leave the county of San Diego without permission from a judge. And even then it was for, I think, maybe a week at a time. So I had to actually get I was seeking to get early termination from my probation.
Hmm.
So I had to go in front of a judge and explain the situation to him. I had my pastor come with me to the hearing and had prepared a statement ahead of time, but it turns out it was the same judge who had originally sentenced me and released me into the rehab program. And so before, issuing the release statement, which was, I had sat through a few of these already, and for the others, it was very just can't think of the right word, but just signing off the paperwork and yes or no,
routine,
kind of thing. Exactly. Yep. And then when he got to me, he said, here's the situation. Before I make a determination, would you mind sharing with the courtroom what's taken place in your life over the last couple of years and how you've gotten to the place where you are today?
Wow.
And so I still don't know if he was a believer. I'm kind of assuming he probably was, but he really set the stage for me and let me share my testimony and share the gospel with the courtroom there.
Wow. And because of that, what was his final judgment?
And then he did release me and allow me out of the probation. So I was able to, my wife and I were able to move across the country to Michigan and, start our training with Ethnos 360.
Yeah, it's hard to be a missionary in another country if they won't let you out of the state.
Right.
So God orchestrated that and gave you an opportunity to share the gospel along the way. That's great. Well, Keith, is there anything else you want to add to your story at this point? Because we brought you up to the present day.
Yeah. No, I just appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate your ministry in particular with Grace Life, with an emphasis on clarity of the gospel. That's one thing, as an organization, we spend a lot of time focusing on as well, because overseas the gospel tends to get muddier when you go into a different language that you're not familiar with, or even a different culture and worldview that you're not familiar with. So yeah, we're thankful for you and others that are like-minded, that are fighting the good fight and trying to keep the gospel clear so that we can, pass that along to others, not add to or take away from the gospel, but just explain exactly who Jesus is and what he did for us so that we can make a decision if we're going to choose to accept and believe that or not.
And so what is your message to somebody who's listening who doesn't have an assurance of any eternal salvation? They're wondering about their future. Maybe they're a little bit scared, a little bit nervous. They don't sleep well at night. They don't have peace, and they've been looking for pleasure, but they haven't found the joy that you talked about. What would you say to them just as we close?
Yeah. I would say that that I'm sure on some level you recognize and believe that there is a God, that God created everything, including you, and desires to have a personal relationship with you. But each of us have all sinned. We've all rebelled against a holy and righteous God. And that sin has caused a separation between us and him. And that, God, in his desire to have a personal relationship with you, he decided to do something about it because he knew that there was nothing that we could do to fix that problem. So he sent his son, who was holy, who was perfect, who was righteous, to take our punishment, which was death, upon himself at the cross, so that we wouldn't have to take that death, that separation that we deserved, and be eternally separated from the Father. So, all that God has asking you to do in response to that is to believe. It's to recognize that you've sinned, you deserve that separation from God, just like I have and we all have. But that what God did for you, he did it all. There's nothing left to do, only to believe and accept that what he did was sufficient. And that he promises that when you do believe that you've passed from life to death, that it's a one-time decision, a one-time choice. And at that moment of belief, you're sealed with the Holy Spirit and you've entered into a relationship with God. You're declared legally righteous, never to be, there is no sin, we're not under condemnation. There's no way for anyone to bring a charge against us that could stick because it's already been paid by Christ.
Amen.
So knowing that, we can rest and put our head on the pillow at night and just know that no matter what happens, we are going to spend eternity with him.
Well, that's great. So there's the objective facts and realities, the positional truths of how we have a right standing with God, that we're forgiven. But then there's the subjective piece that you just mentioned. And going back to your experience of joy, there's the joy unspeakable. Jesus maybe referred to that when he talked about living water that bubbled up within us. Maybe he was referring to the Holy Spirit, but that's who brings us joy, is that life. Well,
Right.
Keith, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I think that there are people listening who might want to do a little thinking about their eternity and at least appreciate God's grace in your life.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity.
We're going to look forward to seeing what God does with you next.
Me as well. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you, Keith. Well,
Yeah.
listen, thank you for joining us for another Grace story. I hope you enjoyed Keith's story, and we'll see what he does with Keith and Jacqueline next. But if you like the podcast, please share it with others, because someone out there needs to hear his story and can relate to it. And subscribe to the podcast. Give us a like or 2, or 5 would be better. And more people will hear it. And you can go to gracelife.org to get in touch with me and a lot of other resources. And would it be Keith at New Tribes NT, or no, it'd be ethnos360.org.com.
So we still have the old email account. So it is ntm.org for New Tribes Mission. So Keith_Stanton at ntm.org. And feel free to contact me.
Okay, there's the invite. If you have any questions for Keith, Keith_Stanton at ntm.org. Keith, God bless you. God keep working in you. Thank you for telling your story. And we'll see everybody on the next story until all here.
Thank you for listening. For more resources, or to help spread the message of God's life-changing grace, visit our website at gracelife.org. We'd love to hear from you. Send us a message at simplybygrace@gracelife.org. See you next time.